Did you know every single economy in the world chases economic growth? But is it even good for them? Let's discuss this in today's videos. Hi friends, welcome to Econverse. I'm Abrar and I'm a fellow student who stopped in my GCSE Economics exam last year in Oman. On this channel, we make learning economics simpler, clearer and hopefully a lot more fun. In this video, we are going to be looking at economic growth in full detail. So let's get started. In this video, we are going to be looking at economic growth in far more detail than we did in our previous time. So what is economic growth? Economic growth is essentially an increase in the capacity of an economy to produce goods and services compared from one period to another. So it is compared over time. So economic growth basically measures the increase in capacity. Remember the word capacity to produce of an economy to produce goods and services. So basically an increase in capacity. Now economic growth is when there's an increase in the real output of an economy until they reach full capacity. So it can be seen on your diagrams when you have a complete rise in real output. So as you remember, there's real output on the x-axis and there's price level on the y-axis. So from what we know, basically economic growth is when there is a complete rise until YFE. So it is until full employment is achieved. Now, how do you measure real output? Now that is the question. So when you look at how you measure real output, one of the most common ways to measure real output is something called GDP, gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is a monetary measure. It's a monetary measure of the value of all. Now there's some critical words in this definition that you must remember. Of all final goods and services produced in a period of current, current is a very key price of current prices. Now that is the definition of gross domestic product. Now let me explain what these two key words basically highlight in this sentence. So final basically denotes that only goods which have reached their final consumable stage are taken into account. And when you look at current prices reflects to the nominal prices that are not adjusted to inflation. So the current prices are the prices as it is without taking into account inflation. So there's inflation is not adjusted for essentially. Now when you look at GDP, there's two key ideas that you need to remember. Number one is real GDP and number two is nominal GDP. It's important to understand what is the difference between these. Now real GDP is GDP that is adjusted for inflation. So GDP that is measured of factor prices without the inflation that is affecting it or distorting it. Whereas nominal GDP is GDP that is measured with inflation. So when you look at an example, now let's assume you have a place that produces 10 units of a product. 10 units. And it's sold for 100. And let's say the next year they're essentially making 135. However, they've only made 9 units this year. So now if you see, this is your year 1 and this is your year 2. Now this actually shows a very interesting argument. So in this case, if you were to use nominal GDP, you would believe that there is a rise in your GDP because you've gone from 100 to 135. There's been a massive increase in your monetary measure based on current prices, which means there's been inflation. However, if you were to take real GDP, you would say there's been a fall in GDP from 10 units to 9 units. So now, what this shows us is the significance of the conflict between real and nominal GDP. So it's always advisable to use the real GDP to ensure that inflation does not distort any of the data. Now, another key important thing to note from the definition is the idea that there is a monetary value, a monetary measure that is being used. This is often used to remove the differences in units and bring about uniformity. So now we've discussed how GDP is used to measure real output. Now we need to understand how GDP is even calculated. So now let's look at the different ways through which GDP calculation happens. So when you look at the GDP calculation, there's essentially 3 main ways through which this operates. You have firstly your value added method, then you have your expenditure method, and lastly you have your income method. So these are the 3 ways through which GDP is calculated. So what does each of these mean? So the value added method essentially uses the final value of all goods and services. So the final value, and it subtracts it, it takes away any intermediate costs. So that is how GDP is calculated in this case. Then when you look at the expenditure method, it is essentially called GDE, or it basically uses the aggregate demand formula in order to come up with a GDP. So it takes a monetary value of consumption through the C plus I plus G plus X minus M, or aggregate demand. And then lastly, the income method is when you take the income from each factor of production as your calculation for GDP. So factor incomes. So your aggregated factor incomes gives you GDP. So now we have looked at how GDP is calculated. However, now we must address a couple of key issues here. So there are some major issues in calculating GDP. Some of the key issues are, firstly, there's something called black markets, or you can say unaccounted economic activity. Some people also call it an informal economy, which is when you have a parallel economy that isn't even mentioned in the books of tax. Basically, there's economic activity that's occurring which is unaccounted for. Number 2, there's high registration costs. Now, whenever you have very high registration or administrative costs, firms may not register. They can look to evade taxes, which can completely distort real GDP calculations. And then there's output by illegal immigrants, and then you have non-marketed self-made goods and services. So this could be, now what I mean by this is, if you know, there is a sector of farming which actually makes the product for themselves. It's not commercial farming, it is I believe subsistence farming, which is when you essentially make the product for yourself and you use it for your own purposes, and you do not sell it in the market as of such. So now we've looked at how GDP is calculated, what are some issues with GDP. Now, in the previous video on economic growth, we addressed how there's a difference between actual economic growth and potential economic growth. Now, it's key to understand the short run versus long run causes of economic growth. So, in the short run, how is economic growth caused? It is actually caused through a rise in your aggregate demand. Whenever you have a rise in aggregate demand, it leads to a rise in your real GDP in the short run. However, in the long run, essentially what happens in the long run is you have a higher quantity and quality of resources, which can lead to LRAS increasing, which could actually,
I found this on the web,
which could lead to potentially higher productive potential in the long run. So this is actually shown by a shift, whereas this is shown by, you could say, a rise in the PPC. So when you have the PPC, this to this would be actual increase, would be short term increase, and this to this curve would be long term increase. Now I've just drawn a random curve. You need to label your curves properly, obviously. And then now I think it's really important for us to understand what the consequences of economic growth are. So now let me just break it down into these two parts. So when we look at consequences, we need to understand that economic growth has two sides to it. It has a positive side to it, which I'm going to write in blue. So let's look at some positives. Now, whenever you have economic growth, you can argue that there's higher living standards, because whenever you have economic growth, essentially lots of people have more income which they can use to buy their basic necessities, and there's higher living standards overall. Then there's more employment, because whenever you have more economic activity, labor is derived demand, so there would be higher employment. There could be better infrastructure when you have better economic growth, because now firms want to invest in your country, foreign firms want to invest, there could be MNCs coming in, which could certainly improve the infrastructure. There could be better tech, there could be lower poverty, because now many people have income as they're employed, and then you can say that the global influence of your economy rises. Global influence. Now this is a point on global politics. So these are some of the massive benefits. However, on the other hand, we need to address some important disadvantages. Firstly, your environment. Now this is a key point, and let me tell you, examiners love this. When you bring in the argument that the environment is being affected due to economic growth, examiners truly love it. And it is a fabulous point to make, because that is one of the main opportunity costs of having high economic growth. Your environment ends up being degraded. There's a lot of forests that are being cut down to build factories. There's inequality. Now, one of the key arguments that you can make is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The gap between them due to economic growth simply rises, simply aggravates. And then you can talk about the depletion of natural resources, of how natural resources such as coal, etc., are being depleted, and then you're not able to transfer onto a more renewable side. And then you can have the argument that whenever you have higher economic growth, you have chances for inflation, because you're leading to demand pull inflation. So one of the main solutions to everything that we have talked about is the idea of sustainable economic growth. Sustainable economic growth. Now, this is a very key idea. What it basically means is a rise in aggregate supply, long run economic growth, rate of economic growth that isn't too high so as to retain renewable resources for the future and maintain consumer confidence. So, it's to prevent the overuse of natural resources, it's to ensure that the environment and everything is being considered such that you're growing economically while at the same time ensuring long-term benefits. So that is it for economic growth. If you think this video helped you understand economics better, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join the Econverse. I'll see you again in the next video.